The stagecoach rolled into Harlan's crossing on a Tuesday in late October of 1879, kicking up a cloud of red dust that settled over the main street like a thin curtain. And when its door swung open, only one passenger climbed down, a woman in a black dress, carrying nothing but a small carpet bag, and the hollow look of someone who had already lost everything worth losing. Her name was Alma Cooper, and she was 26 years old, and she had nowhere left to go. The town of Harlan's Crossing sat in the middle of the Texas Panhandle like a forgotten thought, a scattering of buildings along a single unpaved road that turned to mud when it rained and cracked like old skin when it did not. There was a general store owned by a stout man named Briggs, a saloon called the Dusty Spur that never seemed to close, a small church with a leaning steeple, a livery stable, and maybe 40 souls who called this patch of hardpan earth their home. It was not a glamorous place. It was not a kind-looking place either, at first glance. But it was the end of the line for the stagecoach route, and Alma had spent the last of her husband's small inheritance on the ticket to get here. And so here was where she would stay, whether the town welcomed her or not. She stood beside the road, her carpetbag at her feet, watching the stagecoach driver toss the remaining luggage from the roof with a complete absence of ceremony. She had one other bag, a battered leather satchel that had been her husband Gerald's, and it landed in the dust with a dull thud that somehow felt appropriate, as though all the weight of the last year had been compressed into that sound. Gerald Cooper had died 8 months ago, from a fever that swept through their small homestead outside of Amarillo like a fire through dry grass. He had been 31. He had been kind and hardworking and not particularly lucky, and the homestead had not lasted 6 weeks after he passed. The bank had arrived with papers before the grass on his grave had even had time to settle. She had sold what she could, packed what remained, and gotten on a succession of coaches heading anywhere that was not there, because there had become unbearable. Alma picked up both bags, squared her shoulders under her black dress, and looked up and down the main street of Harlan's Crossing with the careful, measuring gaze of a woman who has learned that survival requires accurate assessment of a situation before anything else. "You lost, ma'am." The voice came from her left, and she turned to find a man standing just outside the livery stable, one arm resting against the wooden post of its entrance as if he and the post had an understanding. He was tall, genuinely tall, not just tall compared to the average, but the kind of tall that made you recalibrate your spatial sense of the world around him. He wore a worn canvas duster the color of dried wheat, dusty boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his eyes so that she couldn't quite read them from where she stood. He appeared to be somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly against his collar and a jaw that carried several days of unshaved growth. "I am not lost," Alma said, with more steadiness in her voice than she actually felt. "I have arrived exactly where I intended to arrive." He tilted his head at this, the way a man does when he's trying to work out whether he's being told the truth or a politely worded version of it. "That's so," he said. "You got family here, someone expecting you." "No." He was quiet for a moment. The dust settled around them both. Somewhere behind her, the stagecoach driver had climbed back up to his seat and was already turning his horses for the return journey. The whole business of dropping a widow in the middle of nowhere apparently complete to his satisfaction. "Then I suppose you'll be needing to know where things are," the man said, and he pushed off the post and walked toward her. Up close, she could see his eyes clearly now. They were an unremarkable shade of brown, but there was something attentive in them, something that suggested the man behind them listened more than he spoke, and paid more attention than most people bothered to. "Lionel Atkins," he said, and he extended his hand without any particular fanfare, as simply as if they had been introduced at a church social. She looked at the hand for a single beat. It was a calloused hand, weathered by rope and weather and honest labor. "Alma Cooper," she said, and took it, and they shook once. "Mrs. Cooper," he said, because the black dress told him what he needed to know. "Welcome to Harlan's Crossing. It's not much, but it's honest about that, which is more than some places can say." She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. "Where would I find lodging?" she asked. He turned and pointed down the street. "Mrs. Hattie Drummond runs the only boarding house. Second building past the general store, the one with the blue shutters. She's a fair woman and she doesn't charge more than she ought to." He paused. "You hungry? She'll likely have something on if it's near supper time, which it is." Alma realized with a small jolt of embarrassment that she was, in fact, desperately hungry, having not eaten since early that morning. She had been rationing what remained of her money with the grim precision of someone who knows the end of her reserves is visible from where she stands. "I am," she said, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. "Then I'd go there first," Lionel Atkins said, and he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of simple courtesy, and then he turned and walked back toward the livery stable without making anything more of the exchange than what it was. She watched him go for a moment, this tall, quiet man who had offered directions and a small kindness to a stranger in a black dress, and then she picked up her bags and walked in the direction he had pointed. Hattie Drummond was exactly what Lionel had described: fair, no nonsense, and possessed of an expression that suggested she had seen enough of life's harder edges to be unshockable, which Alma found immediately comforting. She was a stout woman somewhere past 60, with silver hair pinned severely and quick eyes that assessed Alma from head to foot in approximately 3 seconds. "Widow," Hattie said. It was not a question. "8 months now," Alma said. "You got money?" "Some." Alma was honest about it. "Not a great deal." Hattie looked at her for another long moment, then stepped back from the door. "Come in. Supper's on. We'll work out the particulars afterward." The boarding house smelled of beef stew and wood smoke, and there were 3 other boarders at the supper table: a traveling merchant named Collier who spoke too much about himself, a quiet young man named Pete who worked at the general store and barely lifted his eyes from his bowl, and an older, wiry man named Dutch who turned out to be one of the hands on a ranch outside of town, and was there only because he'd had a tooth pulled that afternoon and the dentist had advised against riding. Alma ate more than she intended to, because the stew was good, and because her body had decided that hunger was no longer something it was prepared to be polite about. She contributed very little to the conversation at the table, but she listened carefully, the way she always listened, gathering information about where she had landed. Harlan's Crossing, as best she could piece together from the supper conversation, was a cattle town in the early stages of what might generously be called development. The railroad had been talked about for years and had not arrived yet, which kept the town smaller than it might otherwise have been. There were several large ranches in the surrounding area, and most of the town's commerce was connected to them. It was a hard landscape, beautiful in its brutal way, with the sky so wide above the flat land that it seemed almost excessive, as though whoever had designed this part of the country had been working on a scale that had not yet been communicated to the people who lived under it. After supper, Hattie sat Alma down in the small sitting room that adjoined the kitchen, poured 2 cups of strong coffee, and looked at her with the directness of a woman who sees no virtue in dancing around a subject. "How bad is it?" she asked. Alma wrapped both hands around her cup. "I have $17.40, she said, "and 2 bags of clothing and a sewing kit and a Bible." Hattie was quiet for a moment. "Can you sew?" "Very well," Alma said, and this was true. Her mother had taught her, and she had always been good at it, the kind of precise, unhurried skill that came naturally to her. "There's a dressmaker in the next town over, but nothing here," Hattie said. "People make do or they wait for the catalog. You could set up in the sitting room here to start, and we could work out a reduced room rate while you get yourself established." She said this without warmth or coldness, simply as a practical arrangement that made sense for both parties involved. "I'm not running a charity," she added, "but I'm also not the kind of woman who turns a person out when there's a reasonable solution available." Alma felt something unknot slightly in her chest, not relief exactly, but the first loosening of the tight vigilance that had been her constant companion for 8 months. "I accept," she said. "Thank you." Hattie gave a short nod and refilled both their cups. "Lionel Atkins was the one who pointed you here, I'd wager," she said, though it was not really a question. "He was," Alma said. "He was at the livery when I arrived." "That's where he'd be," Hattie said. "He manages the livery for old Sam Garrett, who's too arthritic now to do it himself. Lionel's been in Harlan's Crossing about 3 years." She paused, seeming to measure something. "He's a good man. Quiet, but good. The quietness sometimes makes people mistake him for cold, but that's not what it is." Alma noted this without comment, and then she finished her coffee and asked to be shown to her room, because the day had been very long and she was so tired she could feel it in the marrow of her bones. Her room was small and clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the backyard where Hattie kept a small kitchen garden, mostly put to bed now for the winter. Alma unpacked her 2 bags with the careful economy of someone who has learned to keep everything in its proper place, folded Gerald's old satchel flat and tucked it under the bed, and then sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the town settling into its night. The distant, muffled sounds from the dusty spur, the occasional bark of a dog, the wind moving through the dry grass beyond the edge of the buildings. She did not cry. She had already done a great deal of crying in the 8 months just past, and she had come to a private agreement with herself that she would look forward from now on, because looking backward only showed her the same things over and over: the fever, the bank, the empty homestead, the road that had led here. She was in Harlan's Crossing. She had a room, a plan, and $17.40. This was not nothing. This was, in fact, the beginning of something, even if she couldn't yet see what shape that something would take. She lay down on the narrow bed, still in her black dress because she was too tired to change it, and she was asleep before the candle on the washstand had burned down another inch. The next morning she rose before the rest of the house, washed her face, put on the second of her 2 dresses, also black, because she was still in mourning, and went downstairs to offer Hattie help with breakfast. Hattie, who turned out to be a deeply practical woman who understood the value of a person who got up early and worked without being asked, accepted the help without fanfare, and the 2 women moved around the small kitchen together with a surprisingly easy rhythm. Over the following days, Alma settled into the boarding house and began to take her bearings. She introduced herself to the merchant Briggs at the general store, who was skeptical of her sewing plan, but willing to let her post a small card in his window. She attended the Sunday service at the church, where she sat quietly in a back pew and let the hymns wash over her, and where she was examined with interest by the small congregation, most of whom had never seen her before and were curious in the frank, unabashed way of people who live in isolated places, where new arrivals are genuinely novel events. She saw Lionel Atkins on that first Sunday, standing at the far end of the pews with his hat in his hands, joining in on the hymns in a low, unself-conscious voice. He caught her eye briefly across the church and gave a small nod of recognition, and she returned it, and then they both returned their attention to the service. In those first days, she began to understand the rhythm of Harlan's Crossing. The general store was the social heart of the town in the mornings. The saloon served that purpose in the evenings, though Alma had no occasion or inclination to visit it. The livery stable was the place where information flowed most naturally, because everyone who came through town came through the livery sooner or later, and Lionel Atkins, quiet as he was, seemed to know a great deal about what was happening in and around Harlan's Crossing simply by virtue of listening to everyone who came to have their horses seen to. She brought her first sewing customer within the week, a rancher's wife named Margaret Hollies, who had a dress that needed considerable alteration, and who had heard from Hattie that there was now a woman in town who could do such things properly. Alma spent 2 evenings on the dress, working in Hattie's sitting room by lamplight, and when she delivered it, Margaret Hollies declared it the best needlework she had ever seen and sent her sister-in-law the following Tuesday. It was slow, careful work, building a small trade in a small town, but it was work, and having it steadied her considerably. She was walking back from the Hollies ranch one afternoon, in the second week of November. Margaret had insisted on sending a hired hand to bring her out and back, which Alma had accepted with quiet gratitude since the ranch was several miles outside of town, when the hired hand's wagon nearly collided with a rider coming fast around the bend in the road. There was a brief, loud commotion of horses and shouted words, and Alma was jolted sideways in the wagon seat hard enough to grab the rail, and then everything settled again, and the rider who had caused the near collision pulled up alongside them. It was Lionel Atkins, on a big gray horse that was breathing hard from a long run. He looked at the wagon, looked at Alma, and looked at the hired hand and said, "My apologies, Cole, that was careless of me. Mrs. Cooper, are you all right?" "Quite all right," she said, releasing the rail and straightening herself with as much dignity as the situation permitted. "What's the hurry?" He hesitated. "There's a ranch hand out at the Garrett spread with a broken leg horse through him. I'm going to fetch Doc Parsons." "Then go," she said simply. Something crossed his face, surprise, she thought, at the directness of it, the absence of drama. Then he touched his hat, wheeled the gray horse, and went at a gallop back toward town. Cole, the hired hand, watched him go. "That's Lionel Atkins," he said, as though she might not know. "I'm aware," Alma said. "Good man," Cole said, with the simple certainty of someone who has reached this conclusion through long experience. "So I've been told," she said, and they continued on toward town. It was near the end of November when the first real conversation happened, not the brief, practical exchanges on the street or the acknowledgments across the church, but an actual, extended conversation that left a mark on the day. Alma had gone to the general store for thread and a small supply of fabric that Briggs had received in his latest order, and she was coming out with her parcel when she nearly walked into Lionel, who was coming in. They both stopped and did a brief, slightly awkward shuffle in the doorway, and then both stepped back and looked at each other, and then they both laughed, small, quiet laughs, but genuine ones. "Sorry," he said. "My fault," she said. There was a moment of the usual passing courtesy, and then something held them both on the boardwalk instead of sending them on their separate ways. The afternoon was cold and bright, the sky a hard, clear blue, the wind moving in dry gusts down the main street. She pulled her shawl tighter against it. "How are you finding the town?" he asked. "Settling in," she said honestly. "Hattie has been very kind, and Mrs. Hollies and a few others. People have been better than I feared." He nodded, leaning against the post at the edge of the boardwalk in that same easy way he had stood against the livery post the day she arrived, as though he was comfortable in his own physical space in a way that not everyone is. "This time of year's hard," he said. "Winter coming on. Where were you before?" "Amarillo," she said. Then, because he had a quality of listening that made the sharing of things feel natural rather than exposing, she added, "We had a homestead there. My husband and I." He was quiet for a beat, and it was a respectful quiet, not an uncomfortable one. "What was he like?" he asked. The question surprised her. People generally did not ask this. They acknowledged the fact of the loss and moved quickly past it, as though death were a topic that required speed to traverse. His asking it directly made something in her throat tighten. "Honest," she said after a moment. "Hardworking, gentle." She looked down at the parcel in her hands. "He used to name the chickens, every single one of them." She smiled at this, a private, sideways smile that she hadn't expected to feel. "I told him that was a foolish thing to do with an animal you might eventually need to eat, and he said that a named creature deserves a little more dignity in this life, regardless of what comes after, and he just kept right on naming them." Lionel was quiet. Then, "He sounds like a man worth knowing." "He was," she said, and the grief in her voice was present but clean, not sharp anymore, more like a scar than a wound. She looked up at him. "Were you ever married?" The question was direct, possibly too direct, but he had asked her something direct, so it seemed like the territory was established. He did not seem to mind it. "No," he said, "never quite got there." He said this without evident regret and without the defensive quality some men have about such admissions. "I moved around a good deal in my 20s. Cattle drives, ranch work, didn't stay anywhere long enough to build much. And now you've stayed." 3 years, he agreed. "Something about this place." He looked up and down the street, seeming to search for what that something was, or perhaps already knowing it but finding it difficult to put into words. "It's honest about what it is, like I said when you arrived." "You did say that," she agreed. A gust of wind came and she pressed the shawl tighter. "I should get back. Hattie will have supper on." "Of course," he said, and he straightened from the post and held the door of the store for a customer who was leaving, because that was simply the kind of man he was. "Mrs. Cooper." "Mr. Atkins," she said, and she walked back down the boardwalk toward the boarding house, and she was aware that the afternoon felt slightly different from how the morning had felt, as though the conversation had altered the temperature of the day in some small, quiet way. December arrived with the first real cold, and with it a sharpness in the air that made the sky look even bigger and the land even more enormous. Harlan's crossing drew inward with the cold, the way small communities do, spending more time indoors, visiting more, keeping fires going. Alma's sewing work increased, because winter was when people wanted things mended or made, when they had more time to think about the dress that needed taking in or the curtains that needed replacing. She had established a small but solid reputation in the town by now. She was known as the Widow Cooper, the one who sewed, who lived at Hattie Drummond's, who was quiet and competent and not likely to cause anyone any trouble. She had also begun to be known as someone who was sharper than she first appeared. She had a wit that came out occasionally in unexpected places, dry and light, and people who caught it tended to be pleasantly surprised by it. Lionel she saw regularly, because Harlan's Crossing was not a large town and there was only one main street, and they had fallen into an easy pattern of exchanging a few words when they happened to be in the same place, which was often enough. She brought her horse. Hattie kept an old mare that Alma had begun using for her trips to the outlying ranches, to the livery regularly, and these visits had lengthened from quick, practical calls into conversations that lasted 10 or 15 minutes, leaning against the stall doors while the mare ate, talking about the town, or the weather, or books, because it turned out Lionel Atkins was a reader of considerable range for a man who spent his days in a livery stable. He had a small collection of books stacked on a shelf inside the livery office, and she began to borrow them. She had always read, but access to books on the frontier was limited, and the discovery that he had a battered copy of Dickens and several volumes of history, and a collection of poetry that had clearly been read many times. The spines were cracked, and the pages had that soft, well-handled quality of books that have been important to someone, delighted her in a way she hadn't expected. "You're surprised," he said one afternoon, watching her examine the poetry volume with evident pleasure. "A little," she admitted. "Forgive me, that's unfair." "It's honest," he said, with a slight lift at the corner of his mouth that she had come to recognize as his version of a smile before it became a full one. "My mother was a reader. She believed books were the one luxury a person could carry with them without it costing them anything in the carrying." He paused. "She gave me those volumes when I left home. I've replaced some of them twice. They've gotten so worn." Alma turned the poetry volume over in her hands. It was Tennyson. She opened it to a page that had been dog-eared, a poem about a brook, about continuity, about the way things persist past their seeming end. She read the first few lines silently, and then looked up and found him watching her with a careful, quiet attention that she had noticed before and that she had decided she liked, because it was not intrusive, it was interested, which was a different thing entirely. "I'll take good care of it," she said. "I know," he said simply. Christmas came and went in the way Christmas does in a frontier town, simply, warmly in the church, with a shared meal at Hattie's that included a number of boarders and neighbors, with modest gifts and hymns and a cold, clear night full of stars. Alma sewed a pair of warm gloves for Hattie from good wool she had been setting aside, and Hattie gave her a knitted shawl in deep burgundy that was the first color Alma had worn in 8 months, and she put it on over her black dress, and something about the combination felt like a step toward something, though she couldn't have named what. Lionel brought a bottle of good whiskey and a cloth-wrapped parcel to Hattie's Christmas supper that turned out to contain 2 pounds of excellent coffee, which Hattie received with an enthusiasm that suggested this was a known and beloved gift from a known source. He sat across from Alma at the table and they talked most easily of the evening, and afterward, when the dishes were cleared and a few of the guests had drifted toward the sitting room, she sat near the fire and he sat nearby, and they talked about Christmas as children. He had grown up in Missouri, she in Virginia, and the conversation had the quality of a thing with its own weight and warmth, like the fire beside them. He left before the evening was very advanced, because the livery still needed tending regardless of the holiday, and he said good night to the room in his quiet way, and then he paused by Alma's chair and said, "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Cooper," and the directness of looking at her when he said it, not at the room, but at her, specifically stayed with her after he had gone. She turned this observation over in the privacy of her own thoughts for several days, the way you turn a stone over and look at what is under it, examining the thing with honest eyes. She recognized what it was, a growing feeling, a warmth when she thought about him, an anticipation of the next time they would be in the same place. She also recognized that it was complicated, because she was still in mourning, because she had arrived in this town with nothing and was still finding her feet, because she had learned from losing Gerald that love was not a safe thing to hold, and she was not sure she had the courage for it again. But she had also learned from losing Gerald that life was shorter and more fragile than anyone liked to think about, and that a person who refused to feel things because feeling was risky was really only losing twice, once to the fear, and once to whatever she might have had. She thought about Gerald. She thought about what he would say. She thought about the chickens he had named, and the gentleness with which he had moved through the world, and she was fairly certain that if he could have spoken to her, he would have told her to be a fool for love whenever love offered itself, because life was too short and too dry in the doing of it to refuse a thing that could make it green. The January of 1880 came in hard, with 3 days of snow that was unusual for that part of Texas but not impossible. The town went quiet under it. The boarding house was warm and close, and Alma worked steadily on her sewing through those 3 days, finishing a set of curtains for one of the ranch wives and mending a coat for Dutch, who had returned to take a room again after another dental procedure, and who treated her with the simple, uncomplicated kindness of a man who has been raised right and never forgotten it. On the 4th day, when the snow had thinned to a crust and the sun was out, and the world was loud with dripping water and birds reappearing, Alma bundled up in her coat and her new burgundy shawl and walked to the livery to return the Tennyson volume and pick up something new. Lionel was in the main stable, repairing a piece of harness by lamplight, his big hands working the leather with patient care. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face did what it always did when he saw her, settled somehow, as though her presence was a known quantity that resolved some ambient uncertainty. "You survived the snow," he said. "I grew up in Virginia," she said. "This is not what I would call serious snow." "It is to Texans," he said. She laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, and the sound of it made the horses shift and look around with idle curiosity. She held out the Tennyson. "I finished it. It's wonderful. I'd forgotten how much I love that poem about the brook." She paused. "I read it 3 times. He took the book and set it carefully on the shelf, running his thumb along the spine with that habitual care she had noticed. "There's a volume of Emerson," he said, reaching for another. "If you haven't read him." "Some of it," she said. "Not all." He handed it over, and in the handing she noticed that he was also still holding it, and they were both holding the same book for a moment, and they were standing rather closer than the act of book passing strictly required, and she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the moment had a quality of its own, clear and suspended. She stepped back just slightly. He let the book go. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said. He turned back to the harness, but she had the impression it required a degree of deliberate focus that it had not required before. "How is the sewing trade?" he asked, with a casualness that was only slightly studied. "Growing," she said, equally carefully ordinary. "I'm thinking about whether there's a way to get larger orders. The ranches are far enough out that the trips take time. But if I could send word that I was available for more substantial work, curtains, upholstery, clothing, it might be worth it." He was quiet for a moment, working the leather. "There's a meeting of the area ranchers next week at the Hollies' place," he said. "They get together every couple of months, talk over water rights, grazing, that kind of thing. Mrs. Hollies hosts it. She'd probably let you put yourself forward at the start of it before the business proper." He glanced at her. "She thinks well of you. She's told me so." Alma processed this. "You and Mrs. Hollies talk about me." "Harlan's Crossing is a small town," he said, with that corner of the mouth lift. "People talk about everyone." "What does she say?" she asked, and there was something in the question that was slightly more than idle curiosity, and they both knew it. He put down the harness and looked at her directly, the way he did when he had decided something was worth the directness. "She says you're one of the most quietly capable people she's encountered in some time," he said. "And she's a woman of considerable experience and significant judgment, so I'd take that as high praise." Alma was, for once in her adult life, at a loss for an immediate response. She recovered. "That is very kind of her," she said, and her voice was steady, though she was aware of a warmth in her face that had nothing to do with the lamp. She went to the ranchers' meeting with Margaret Hollies' blessing, arriving in a clean dress, still black, but the finest of what she had, and presenting herself with the composed directness that was her natural manner. The ranchers, most of them men with their wives alongside them, listened with varying degrees of interest to her brief description of her services. 3 commissions came out of it within the week, including a substantial order for a set of linen curtains for the bunkhouse at the largest spread in the area, which would keep her busy for a month and pay enough to set her considerably more at ease. She told Lionel about this the next time she came to the livery, and he listened with evident satisfaction, as though the success were something he had a stake in, and she supposed in a small way he did, having pointed her toward the meeting. "I'm glad," he said, and he meant it. She could hear it in the plainness of the words. He was a man who did not say things he did not mean, which made everything he did say worth listening to. February in Harlan's Crossing was cold and brown and quiet, and it was in this unpromising month that the story between Alma Cooper and Lionel Atkins moved from whatever it had been before into something else, and this is how it happened. There was a fire. Not a large fire, no lives lost, no catastrophe, but the tool shed at the back of Hattie Drummond's boarding house caught from a spark blown off a neighbor's chimney one evening just after dark, and by the time it was noticed and dealt with, the shed was gone and the smoke had gotten into the boarding house, and Hattie's kitchen was blackened along one wall, and the house smelled of scorched wood for days afterward. No one was hurt. Hattie's composure in the face of it was extraordinary. She organized the bucket line herself, directed people with the authority of a woman who has lived long enough to understand that the difference between disaster and difficulty is largely a matter of how calmly you respond. Alma was beside her through the whole thing, hauling water with everyone else, ignoring the heat and the ash and the fact that her best dress was going to be unsalvageable. Lionel had come at a run when someone from the bucket line shouted for him. He had been among those who got the fire under control before it reached the main structure of the house, working the buckets with a focused, tireless efficiency that left him smelling of smoke and soaked to the elbows. Afterward, when the fire was out and the assessment of damage was being made and the neighbors who had helped were drifting home, Alma sat down on the back step of the boarding house in the cold, smoky dark and felt suddenly and completely exhausted in a way that went past the physical. She was still holding an empty bucket. Her hands were shaking slightly, she noticed, the adrenaline leaving. She heard boots on the ground and looked up. Lionel sat down beside her on the step. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. He said nothing at all for a full minute, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that means I am here, and I know how hard today was, and I am not going anywhere. You're shaking, he said finally. Delayed response, she said, with a somewhat unsuccessful attempt at her usual steadiness. He reached over and, with the matter-of-fact care of a man who is not making a thing of a moment that deserves to be made of, took the bucket out of her hands, set it aside, and then simply wrapped both his large, warm, smoke-smelling hands around her cold ones. Not in any way that was forward or presumptuous, in the way of someone who sees a practical problem and addresses it. Her hands were cold and shaking. He was warm. It was the simplest arithmetic. But her hands stilled, held in his, and something that was more than cold and more than shaking went quiet along with them. She didn't pull away. He didn't let go. They sat on the cold back step of Hattie Drummond's boarding house in the aftermath of a fire, in the dark, in February, and the world around them, the distant sounds of the town, the smell of smoke, the cold of the Texas winter, was entirely peripheral to the small bright fact of their joined hands. "You work very hard," he said at length, not admiringly, exactly, more as though he was noting something important that had been needing to be said. "Since you arrived, you haven't stopped." "There's been no reason to stop," she said. "Rest is a reason," he said. She looked at their hands, hers tucked inside his. "When you've had very little," she said slowly, "and you've lost what you did have, stopping feels dangerous. Keeping moving feels like the only way to stay ahead of." She hesitated. "Fear," he said quietly, without judgment. "Yes," she said, "fear." The word dropped into the quiet between them and settled there honestly, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And then Hattie called from inside to ask whether they were ready for hot coffee, and Lionel let go of her hands with the same gentle practicality with which he had taken them, and they both stood up and went inside. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Alma listened to the house settle around her and thought about Lionel Atkins's hands around hers, and about the way the fear had gone quiet in that moment, and about the fact that she was not as afraid as she had been this morning, though nothing about her circumstances had changed, except that she had sat in the cold dark and had her hands held by a man who seemed to see her with considerable accuracy. She thought about the burgundy shawl she wore now sometimes, even when it was not cold, because it was color and she had been wearing black for too long. She thought about Gerald naming the chickens. She thought, "I think I am falling in love with him." She considered this for a long time in the honest dark, and found that she was not afraid of it. Spring came slowly to the Texas Panhandle, the cold retreating in increments, the light changing first before the temperature agreed to follow. The grass came back, pale and tentative at first, then greening properly through March, and with it a general loosening of the world that Alma felt in her own chest, as though winter had been a kind of held breath and the spring was the exhale. Her sewing work had grown enough that she had moved out of Hattie's sitting room and into a small rented room in a building near the general store that had been used as an office by a lawyer who had moved on the previous year. It was not large, but it had good light from a south-facing window, which was everything for sewing, and she had set up her work table facing it and had a chair for customers and a bolt of muslin pinned to one wall as a sample of the quality she offered. And it looked, she allowed herself to think, like a real business. She had taken off the black dress in February. She still wore it occasionally, when custom and conscience felt it was required, but she had made herself 3 new dresses from fabric she'd bought from Briggs, one in a warm gray, one in a deep blue that Hattie said suited her coloring, and one in a pale green that she saved for Sundays. Each dress she made was both a professional demonstration and a private declaration that she was still here, still building, still alive. Lionel noticed the blue dress on the day she first wore it, standing outside the general store when she came out. He looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes looked at her, that careful, attending look, and then said, "That's a fine color," as simply as he would have said anything else, and then asked about her business as he always did, and the conversation moved on. But she had caught what was in his eyes before the words, and it was not nothing, and it kept her warm all the way home. She had also begun to understand, through the small community of Harlan's Crossing's social life, that Lionel Atkins had a history that was not uncomplicated. She learned it not from him. He was not a man who talked about himself much without prompting, but from pieces she gathered here and there, from Hattie and Dutch and the merchant Collier and the general store owner Briggs. He had come to Harlan's Crossing from Kansas, where he had spent several years doing ranch work after years on cattle drives. Before that, Missouri, where he had been raised. He had a sister still in Missouri whom he wrote letters to. There had been a woman once in Kansas. She had died in childbirth, along with the child. He had not spoken of this to Alma, and she had not raised it, but understanding it reshaped some of the things she thought she already knew about him: the quietness, the self-containment, the way he could sit with someone else's grief without needing to rush past it. He had lost things too. This did not surprise her exactly, but it deepened her sense of him. They were two people who had learned that life was not particularly careful with what it handled. In April, there was a town social, a square dance held at the church hall, which Harlan's Crossing did every spring as a kind of communal celebration of having survived another winter. It was festive and a little chaotic, with a fiddle player from the next town over and several ranch hands who danced with great enthusiasm and limited skill, and children running in and out of the building, and a long table of food that people had brought from their homes. Alma had gone intending to sit at the side and watch, because she had not danced since Gerald and was not certain she was ready, and she genuinely was not sure dancing was appropriate for her circumstances. But Margaret Hollis had caught her arm within 10 minutes of her arrival and informed her firmly that she was absolutely going to dance, and had installed her in a square with 3 other couples before Alma had fully processed the sequence of events. She danced 2 sets and found to her own surprise that she enjoyed them. The music was lively, and the other dancers were good-humored about mistakes, and there was something about the movement and the music that felt simply good, like something coming back. After the second set, she was laughing slightly and out of breath at the edge of the floor, and she turned and found Lionel standing nearby, leaning against the wall with a cup of cider, watching her. He was dressed better than usual, a clean shirt, no work coat, and he looked, she noticed, rather fine for a Tuesday in spring. "You dance," he said. "It appears so," she said, catching her breath. "Would you?" He stopped. Something in his face did a brief, careful negotiation with itself. "Would you want to one more time, with me, I mean?" She looked at him. He was watching her with that steady, honest attention that she had come to think of as his particular form of bravery, the willingness to just look directly at things without flinching from what he might see. "Yes," she said, "I would." They danced 1 set together, and they danced it well, because they had both learned from people who danced properly, and because there was an ease between them by now that translated into physical space. They moved together without the awkward adjustments of strangers, his hand at her waist a light, sure pressure, her hand on his shoulder, the music filling all the space that might otherwise have felt charged or uncertain. When the set ended and they stood facing each other, both slightly warm from the dancing, his hand still resting at her waist for just a moment before he stepped back, she understood that something had definitively changed between them, and from the look in his eyes, he understood it too. They walked home together afterward in the cool spring night, because his route back to his rooms above the livery went the same direction as Hattie's. It was the first time they had been alone together outside of the livery, and the night was clear, the stars enormous, the town quiet. They talked about small things, the social, the music, the spring coming on, and also about large things, in the easy, unguarded way that comes when the sky is big enough, and the night is quiet enough, and you are walking beside someone who has already heard the honest version of you. She told him about Gerald. Not the facts of him. She had shared those in pieces already. But the texture of the marriage, what it had been like to love someone that careful and that unlucky, and what it was like to lose him. She told him about the moment she had realized the homestead was gone and that she was alone, and how the road to Harlan's Crossing had felt like stepping off the edge of a world she understood into one she didn't. He listened. When she was done, he said nothing for a moment, just walking beside her in the dark. Then, "I had a woman I was going to marry," he said. "In Kansas. Her name was Clara." He said it the way you say something that you've said before, but only to yourself, internally, never to another person. "She died in the winter of '76. Our son was born too early. He didn't make it either." He said this without drama or self-pity, just as a fact he was handing her honestly, the way he did everything. "I left Kansas shortly after. I wasn't sure where I was going. I drove cattle for a while, and then I came here and I stayed." She said very gently, "I'm sorry, Lionel." "Thank you," he said, and he meant it, the thanks for the simplicity of it, for not reaching for more than condolence when condolence was what was called for. They understood each other, she realized. They had been taught by similar teachers. At the door of the boarding house she turned to him and they stood in the spring dark, and she said, "I'm glad I came here." She paused. "I'm glad you were at the livery that day." "So am I," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, the weight he put under those 3 words, that said everything else. May arrived and the wildflowers came out across the panhandle in a brief, extravagant display, fields of blue and yellow that seemed almost excessive after the long brown of the winter, as though the land were making an argument that it was not as harsh as it had appeared. Alma walked out to see them one morning with Hattie, and stood in the middle of a field of bluebonnets and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific lightness of a person who has come through something difficult and found herself on the other side of it, still intact. She had money in the bank now, not a fortune, but real savings, more than she had had at any point in the last 3 years. She had a business. She had a community. She had friends, Hattie, Margaret Hollies, a few others. She had a borrowed copy of Emerson that she was halfway through, and a standing conversation about it with a man she was falling in love with. She was ready to say something. She was not entirely sure what, but she was ready. He came to her workshop one afternoon in late May with a legitimate errand. One of the ranch wives had sent him with a message about a commission, and they conducted that business efficiently. And then the business was done, but neither of them moved toward the door with any particular urgency. And the afternoon light came in through the south window and lay gold across the work table between them, and Alma looked up from the fabric she had been pretending to straighten. "I think about you," she said. Not dramatically, just truthfully, the way she had decided she was going to be. "I mean to say that I think about you in a way that is more than neighborly." She paused. "I thought you should know." The silence that followed this was not uncomfortable. He was looking at her with that steady, full attention of his, and she could see him arriving at a decision, not reluctantly, not with difficulty, but with the deliberateness of a man who does not do things hastily and means everything he does. "I've been thinking about you that way since November," he said. "Since you laughed in the livery at something I said and the horses all turned to look." She felt the warmth of this travel all the way through her. "November," she said. "That's a long time to keep to yourself." "You were still grieving," he said simply. "I wasn't going to rush anything." She looked at him across the work table with its bolts of fabric and spools of thread. This quiet, patient, attentive man who had offered his hand the day she arrived and asked nothing in return, who had directed her to the boarding house and borrowed her books and held her shaking hands in the February dark, and danced with her in the spring, and walked home beside her through the stars, and told her about Clara with the same honest care with which he did everything. And she felt something that was not at all like the beginning of a feeling. It was the recognition of a feeling that had been growing for a long time and was now very much grown. "Come to supper tonight," she said. "I'll ask Hattie. Come and have supper." "I'll be there," he said. He was. He came clean and presentable and with a small bunch of wildflowers that he offered to Hattie rather than to Alma, which made Hattie go slightly soft in a way she clearly found undignified, and Alma smiled at her plate and said nothing. Supper at Hattie's was long that evening, and noisy, because Dutch was back again, another tooth, and Pete from the store had been invited, and the conversation ranged widely. But through all of it, Alma and Lionel had a separate, quieter conversation conducted almost entirely in looks, and the slight adjustments of proximity, and the way a person's body language shifts when it is relaxed and glad to be where it is. He helped Hattie clear the table afterward because that was the kind of man he was, and then Alma walked him to the door and they stood on the porch in the warm May evening, and she said, "Thank you for coming," and he said, "Thank you for asking." And then he looked at her for a long, quiet moment in the soft evening light and said, "May I call on you properly? Sunday afternoons, if that suits you." "It suits me very well," she said. He touched her hand just briefly, just his fingers against the back of hers, and then he stepped off the porch and walked back down the street toward the livery, and she watched him go with a feeling in her chest that was so full and warm and uncomplicated that she simply let herself feel it without examining it. The way you sometimes stand in the sun and don't think about the physics of light. You just let it be warm on your face. Sunday afternoons became the fixed point of her week. He called at 3, and they walked, or sat on Hattie's porch, or went to the general store together for small purchases, or simply sat in the sitting room and talked while Hattie very deliberately found things to do in the other rooms that gave them privacy without abandoning propriety. They read to each other sometimes, when they had finished a book they both wanted to discuss, she reading a passage, he continuing from where she left off, the voices alternating in the warm afternoon quiet. She learned new things about him in those Sunday conversations. He had a horse he was particularly attached to, not the gray, which was a livery horse, but a roan mare of his own named Birdie that he kept with the livery herd, and that was, by his own admission, willfully independent and occasionally difficult. He sent money to his sister in Missouri every month, partly to help with the costs of raising her 3 children and partly, she suspected, because it was a way of staying connected to the family he had left behind. He had opinions about the railroad that were thoughtful and specific, and about the treatment of the Comanche and Kiowa peoples whose land this had been before the ranches and the towns, and he spoke about the injustices of it with a directness that surprised some people, and that she found she admired deeply. "My father fought in the war," he said one afternoon, talking about land and rights, and the ways the country's boundaries had been drawn and redrawn over the bodies of the people who were inconvenient. He came back different from when he went, quieter. He used to say that men do things they call necessary that are really only convenient, and then they build laws around the convenient things to make them look like necessity, and that's how injustice survives past the moment that created it. He paused. "I think about that when I see what was done to the tribes out here, what's still being done." She listened to this and thought about it, because this was a man who had clearly thought about it himself, at length, with genuine moral seriousness. "You're right," she said. "And saying it matters, even in a small town, even when the only person hearing it is me." He looked at her steadily. "I think you might be the only person I've met in some time who I can say things like this to," he said, "without feeling like I need to soften it." "Don't ever soften it," she said. He smiled at this, the real smile, the full one that came out rarely but transformed his whole face when it arrived. She had been cataloging these smiles without quite admitting to herself that she was doing it, but she had been. Summer came with force to the Texas panhandle, the heat enormous and blue-white, the land going bronze again under it. Alma had a fan she worked constantly in her workshop, trying to keep the air moving, and she had made herself a dress in the palest color she owned, a soft cream that was almost off-white, because the heat made black impossible, and the warmth of the season had made the warmth of everything else in her life feel continuous with it. On a Saturday afternoon in July, Lionel Atkins walked into her workshop with no pretense of an errand and no particular preliminary. He was clearly nervous in a way she had never seen him nervous before. It was subtle, barely detectable, just a slight increase in the deliberateness of his movements, the way he held his hat in his hands when he stood in front of her work table. "Alma," he said. He had been calling her Alma for a month now, and it still had a particular sound when he said it, something careful and glad in it. "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it properly." She set down the fabric she had been holding. She looked at him. Her heart was doing something reasonably dramatic in its cavity. "I'm not a wealthy man," he said. "I manage a livery for a salary, and I have a small amount saved, and a horse named Bertie who is frankly more trouble than she's worth. I don't have a house of my own yet, though I've been looking at a piece of land outside of town that might be the beginning of one." He paused. "I know you've built something here entirely by your own work and your own determination, and I respect that more than I can probably say properly. I'm not offering to rescue you from anything because you don't need rescuing." Another pause. The hat turned in his hands. "But I think we could build something together that would be better than what either of us could build alone, and I know that you are the person I want beside me in the building of it. And I love you, Alma. I have been in the process of loving you since November, probably, and I'm done being quiet about it." She looked at him across the work table with its bolts of cloth and its neat spools of thread, in the bright afternoon light of the July sun, and she felt the full, simple, enormous weight of what he had said, and she knew that she had been waiting for this moment in some form for months without allowing herself to name the waiting, and she was not going to make him wait any longer. "I love you too," she said. "I have been since winter, at least, possibly since the livery in November." She paused. "Is there something you'd like to ask me?" He laughed the surprised laugh, the real one, and then he came around the work table, and he took her hands in both of his the way he had on the back step in February, and he said, "Alma Cooper, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. And then, because the simplicity of it was not quite sufficient for the magnitude of the feeling, "Absolutely yes," without any hesitation whatsoever. He kissed her then for the first time, and it was a proper kiss, not tentative or apologetic, but full and warm and entirely what it was. And the afternoon sun through the south window was bright around them, and outside the main street of Harlan's Crossing went about its ordinary afternoon business, entirely unaware that something irreversible and fine was happening inside the little sewing workshop, with its bolt of muslin pinned to the wall, and its spools of thread on the table. They told Hattie that evening, and Hattie, who was not a sentimental woman as a general rule, went visibly moist-eyed in a way that she immediately attributed to a head cold, and defied anyone present to contradict. She hugged Alma with unexpected fierceness, and told Lionel that he had better deserve her, and he said, very seriously, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to. They were married in September of 1880, at the small church in Harlan's Crossing with its leaning steeple, on a warm, golden morning that had the particular quality of early autumn, not quite summer, not quite fall, right on the beautiful edge between them. Alma wore the cream dress she had made, with a wreath of late wildflowers in her hair that Margaret Hollies had woven for her the night before. She carried no bouquet and needed none. She walked down the aisle of the church on Dutch's arm. He had become, in the months she had known him, something of an unlikely but genuine friend, and the role of giving her away had been offered and accepted with a gruff sincerity that had made her cry, which she had not expected, and which he had responded to by clearing his throat loudly and looking at the ceiling until they were both composed. Lionel was at the front of the church in a suit she had never seen before. He had ordered it from a catalog and she had not known, and it was a very good suit, dark gray, and he stood in it with a stillness that was not nervousness, but the particular calm of a man who has arrived at exactly the right place. When she reached him and Dutch stepped back, and they stood facing each other with the small congregation of Harlan's Crossing arranged behind them in the pews, he took her hand the way he had in November and in February and in the workshop in July, and he looked at her with that complete attending look, and she felt the full circle of everything. The stagecoach, the dust, the grief, the red carpetbag, the livery, the books, the fire, the dancing, the Sunday afternoons, the wildflowers. The July afternoon when he had come around the work table, and she was so grateful for all of it, even the hard parts, because the hard parts had led her here. They said their vows in the plain, serious way of people who mean every word of them, and when the minister pronounced them married, Lionel kissed his bride with such thorough and unself-conscious, feeling that there was a murmur of delighted approval from the congregation, and Hattie's head cold apparently returned with force. Afterward there was a reception at the church hall, the same hall where they had first danced, and the fiddle player came again from the next town over, and they danced most of the afternoon, and there was food and laughter and the easy, genuine warmth of a community that has found something worth celebrating. At some point in the late afternoon, Alma slipped outside for a moment of air, and she stood in the September sun behind the church hall, listening to the music muffled through the wooden walls, and she had a private, internal conversation with Gerald. She still did this sometimes, still talked to him in the quiet places of her mind, and she told him she was happy, and that she thought he would have liked Lionel very much, because Lionel was the kind of man who would have appreciated the naming of chickens. And Gerald would have liked that about him too. And then she went back inside and found her husband waiting for her with a cup of cider and a look on his face that she was still learning all the depths of, but that she had a lifetime to understand. And she took the cider and took his arm, and that was enough. That was more than enough. The piece of land Lionel had been looking at outside of town turned out to be a fine thing. 30 acres of reasonably good grassland, with a creek that ran even in dry years, and a slight natural rise where a house could be set with a view in all directions. They bought it together, combining her savings with his, and they started building in the spring of 1881 with help from the community. Because this was how things were built in Harlan's Crossing, collectively, neighbors giving labor and receiving it. And by summer they had a proper house with 4 rooms and a good porch and windows in all the right places for light. Alma moved her sewing workshop from the rented room in town to a purpose-built room at the side of the house, with the best light she had ever had, north and south windows both, flooding the space evenly, which was a thing she had wanted for years and never had. She continued her work through the building and the moving, because her business was real and her customers were real, and she had no intention of interrupting either. The commissions came from the ranches and from town, and she had begun to make wedding trousseau for brides in the area, which was detailed, fine work that she loved, and that paid better than curtains. Lionel continued with the livery for old Sam Garrett, who was more arthritic than ever and grateful for the reliable management of it. But he also began working the land on their 30 acres in the early mornings and evenings, clearing, fencing, putting in a kitchen garden at the back of the house that Alma oversaw and that produced, by the first full summer, more tomatoes and squash and beans than 2 people could eat, which was a satisfying problem to have. He also brought home 2 chickens that autumn, setting them up in a small coop he built at the edge of the garden, and Alma looked at the chickens and then at him and said, "Don't you dare name them." He looked at her with complete seriousness and said, "I believe this one is Martha and that one is going to be Ruth." She laughed so hard she had to sit down on the porch steps, and he stood there looking pleased with himself in the way he looked when something had gone exactly as he intended it to. And she thought, sitting on those porch steps in the autumn sunshine, that she loved him so thoroughly it was almost a physical weight, something warm and solid that she carried with her everywhere, the best kind of burden. In the early spring of 1882, Alma discovered she was pregnant. She told Lionel on a Sunday morning before he was entirely awake, sitting on the edge of the bed while the pale early light came through the curtain she had sewn herself green linen, the color of new leaves. He lay there listening to what she was saying, and she watched him come fully awake, and she watched the understanding arrive in his face, and then he sat up and put both arms around her and held her against him without saying anything at all for a long moment. "You're all right," he said finally. "I'm well," she said, a bit unsettled in the mornings, but well. He pulled back enough to look at her, his hands cupping her face, and his eyes were doing something she had only seen occasionally, full and open, all the way down. "I am going to be the most careful man in Texas," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know that," she said. She covered his hands with hers. "Don't be too careful, just be here." "I am always here," he said. "I will always be here." He was. Through the pregnancy, which went steadily and without serious complication, he was present in all the ways she needed, practical, attentive, neither hovering nor absent. He drove her to see the doctor in the next town twice, handled the heavier work of the house and garden with the quiet competence that was his natural mode, and sat with her in the evenings on the porch reading aloud when she was too tired to hold a book herself, his voice steady and pleasant in the warm nights. He also built a cradle. He built it himself, from good pine, working on it in the evenings in the small barn they had put up for the horses. She discovered him at work on it one evening when she brought him coffee, and stood in the barn door watching him sand the wood with the same careful patience he brought to everything, and she loved him so much in that moment that her throat hurt with it. The baby was born in November of 1882, a boy, on a cold, bright morning when the prairie outside their windows was silver-white with frost. The doctor came from the next town and Hattie came and stayed, and it was hard going for several hours, the way first births often are, and Lionel waited outside the bedroom door and Hattie came out twice to tell him everything was proceeding normally, and the second time she came out he was sitting on the hall floor with his back against the wall and his hands loose in his lap, and she looked at him and said, "Lionel Atkins, you are the color of old paper," and he said, "I'm fine." And they both knew that was not quite the truth. But when the cry came, that first loud, startling cry, he was on his feet before it had fully sounded, and when Hattie opened the door and said, "Come meet your son," he went through that door and there was Alma, pale and exhausted and entirely magnificent, holding a very new, very vocal, very red-faced baby boy who was apparently unhappy about the whole situation of having arrived. Lionel sat on the edge of the bed and Alma put the baby in his arms, and he held his son. The first time he had held a living child, with the careful steadiness of a man who is aware that he is holding something irreplaceable. And the baby, as if recognizing the quality of the handling, stopped crying immediately and looked up with the unfocused, enormous eyes of the newborn at the person holding him. "Hello," Lionel said to the baby, in a voice so quiet and stripped of everything that was not genuine that Alma felt it in her chest. "I'm your father." They named him James after Lionel's father and added Gerald as a middle name, for Alma's first husband, a choice that Lionel had suggested himself without being asked, because he understood that Gerald Cooper was part of who Alma was and always would be, and that honoring this was not a complicated thing. It was simply the right thing. James Gerald Atkins came into the world screaming and settled into it with a tenacious, interested quality that suggested he had his mother's capacity for careful observation and his father's tendency toward a very personal interpretation of when the rules applied to him. He grew steadily through the winter, warm in the house his parents had built, in the cradle his father had sanded by lamplight. Hattie visited weekly and declared him the most satisfactory baby in the county, which was high praise from a woman who had seen most of the babies born in Harlan's crossing over the past several decades. She took to arriving on Tuesday mornings with something baked, which Alma suspected was less about the baked goods and more about holding James for an hour. And this suited Alma perfectly because an hour on Tuesday mornings, when Hattie held the baby, was an hour she could give to the more detailed sewing commissions that required two steady hands and full attention. The spring of 1883 found the Atkins household in full working order. Alma's workshop had expanded. She had taken on an apprentice, a girl of 16 named Clara Mee, whose mother had died the previous year, and who had been sent to Harlan's Crossing to live with an aunt, and who turned out to have nimble fingers and a good eye for fabric. Alma taught her with the same patient thoroughness with which she did everything, and within 6 months Clara Mee was capable of handling the simpler commissions, which freed Alma for the specialized work. Lionel had made a decision that spring, one they had discussed at length over many evenings. He would leave the livery. Sam Garrett had finally decided to sell the livery itself rather than continue paying someone to manage it. And there was a young man from the next town who was interested in buying it and who had made a reasonable offer, and the arrangement was concluded with goodwill on all sides. Lionel now turned his full attention to the 30 acres, which he was developing as a small cattle operation, not large-scale, not the kind of enterprise that required extensive additional hands, but a modest, careful outfit of good quality that would provide steady income and that would be, over time, built into something to pass on. His first cattle drive as an independent operator was 10 miles long and involved 11 head, and was not what anyone would call dramatic, and he came home from it deeply satisfied in the way of a man who has done something that was entirely his own, and Alma had dinner waiting and James on her hip, and the evening had a quality of rightness that was so complete it was almost hard to contain. In the summer of 1883, there came to Harlan's Crossing a development that had been discussed for years, and had always seemed more rumor than reality: the railroad. The line was extended, not to Harlan's Crossing itself, but to a town 12 miles to the east, close enough that the commercial consequences were significant. Supply costs dropped. Access to larger markets opened. The general store expanded. The town grew not rapidly because Harlan's Crossing was still Harlan's Crossing, honest about what it was, but perceptibly, definitely, with new families arriving and new buildings going up. For Alma's business, this was significant. The access to better fabric suppliers, to specialty threads and findings that had previously been available only through catalogs with weeks of waiting, changed what she could offer. She made her first order to a dry goods house in Dallas that came back in 3 weeks with fabric she had only previously seen in illustrations: silk taffeta, fine wool suiting, delicate cotton lawn for summer dresses. She ran her hands over the new fabrics with something approaching reverence, because the quality of her material was the quality of her work, and she had always worked with less than she knew how to use. She began to accept commissions from towns further afield as her reputation spread, shipping completed garments by rail to customers she would never meet in person. The business that had started in Hattie Drummond's sitting room with a sewing kit and $17 was real in a way that satisfied something deep in her: the knowledge that she had built it herself, from nothing, in a town she arrived in as a stranger. Dutch came by the workshop one afternoon that fall with a request. He was getting married, an improbable and delightful development that he appeared to be simultaneously thrilled about and baffled by, to a widow woman named Sadie who had arrived from New Mexico the previous spring, and who had, in Dutch's words, no patience for nonsense and the best pie in the territory, which Dutch appeared to consider the ideal combination of qualities. He wanted Alma to make Sadie's dress. Alma agreed at once and met Sadie the following week, and found her to be a small, brown-eyed, immensely capable woman who looked at Dutch with the frank, matter-of-fact affection of someone who has decided a thing and sees no reason to be dramatic about it, and thought this was exactly right. She made Sadie a dress in deep rose wool, practical enough for the frontier but beautiful, with pearl buttons down the front that Alma had ordered specially. And when Dutch saw Sadie walk toward him in it, his face did something complicated and simple at the same time, and everyone in the small church felt the sincerity of it and was quietly moved. The autumn of 1884 brought a second pregnancy, which Alma discovered with a combination of joy and the practical awareness of someone who has done this once already and knows what is involved. She was 29 now, healthy and capable and well supported, and the pregnancy went even more smoothly than the first. She worked straight through to the last month, adapting her hours and her pace as needed, and Lionel managed everything around her with the by now familiar combination of competence and care that was simply who he was. This time a girl arrived, in January of 1885, on a cold night with the wind running across the panhandle, with that sweeping, unimpeded force that reminded everyone who lived out here exactly what scale they were operating on. She was calmer than James had been at birth, arriving with a quiet seriousness that made the doctor look twice to confirm she was breathing properly, which she was. She was simply assessing the situation. They named her Frances, after Lionel's mother, and added May as a middle name for no particular reason, except that Alma heard it and knew immediately it was right. James, now 2, was fascinated by his sister, with the proprietary bewilderment of a small child confronted with something new in his household. He regarded her from a safe distance for the first week, then gradually moved closer, and then one afternoon Alma came into the room to find him sitting beside the cradle talking to Frances in a serious, low voice about the chickens. And Frances, who could not have understood a word, was looking at him with an expression of grave attention. Alma stood in the doorway watching them for a long moment and felt the particular, piercing happiness that comes from witnessing something you never expected to have. Lionel found her standing there and stopped beside her, looking at the same thing, and put his arm around her without ceremony, and she leaned against him, and they watched their children together in the afternoon light of their house on their 30 acres, and no one said anything because nothing needed saying. The land itself had changed around them. By 1886, the Atkins place had a proper barn, a good kitchen garden that Alma had refined year by year, a chicken coop with 6 residents, all named by Lionel who named them, in defiance of all practicality, in honor of a tendency that Alma had loved in Gerald and now loved equally in a different man who had come to it independently, which suggested to her that it was simply the mark of a certain kind of person, the kind she was drawn to. The pasture held 22 head of good cattle, and there was talk of expansion. The house itself had been added onto a proper parlor now, and a second bedroom for the children, and a study where Lionel kept his books and wrote his letters to his sister. Clara Mee had become, over the years, a full partner in the sewing business. Alma had formalized this in 1885, making her a paid partner rather than an apprentice, because this was the honest thing to do, and because Clara Mee had more than earned it. The business ran 3 days a week now, with Alma taking the more complex work and Clara Mee the rest, and the workshop at the side of the Atkins house was a pleasant, light-filled, busy place. Harlan's Crossing itself had grown by then to something that could be called, without too much generosity, a proper small town. There was a school opened in 1882, with a teacher from Missouri named Mr. Harris who was quiet and thorough, and whom Alma had quickly identified as excellent. There was a second general store and a small hotel, and a doctor who had taken up permanent residence rather than requiring a 12-mile trip to the next town. The church's leaning steeple had been straightened, and the building itself expanded. Sam Garrett had eventually died peacefully in his chair, which was what he had wanted, and his family had sold the livery to the young man from the next town, who had indeed purchased it and run it well. Hattie Drummond was still at the boarding house with the blue shutters, somewhat slower now but fundamentally unchanged in her direct manner and her excellent coffee. She had told Alma once, in the kitchen at the boarding house, that the best decision she had ever made was taking in a widow with $17 and a carpet bag, and a look of composed determination, because every good thing that had followed in the town's social life had proceeded in some measure from that decision. Alma had told her this was an exaggeration, and Hattie had said it absolutely was not, and then they had drunk their coffee, and the subject had been closed to both their satisfactions. On a Sunday evening in the summer of 1887, Alma sat on the porch of the house she and Lionel had built, in the long golden light of a late afternoon that did not want to give up its warmth, watching her children in the yard. James, now 4, was running with the single-minded urgency that 4-year-olds bring to all physical activity, chasing something, a grasshopper, she thought. Francis, 2.5, was sitting in the dirt at the edge of the garden with the deep concentration of a scientist, examining what appeared to be a particularly interesting pebble. Lionel came out from the house with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her in the other chair, and handed her a cup, and they sat together in the evening warmth watching their children and listening to the sounds of their 30 acres, the cattle settling, the chickens in their coop, the sound of the wind in the grass, distant and enormous and constant. She had been thinking lately about what this had all become, the shape of the life she had built here, from nothing, from a stagecoach and a carpetbag and $17, and a man who had offered directions to a widow and asked nothing for it. She thought about the road that had led to the road that had led here, all the losses and the choices and the distances covered, and she felt not the ache of what had been hard, but the warmth of what it had produced, the way a fire that has burned down to coals is warmer and steadier than the original flame. "What are you thinking about?" Lionel asked, because he could always tell when she was running something through in the interior of herself, and he was, by now, comfortable asking. She turned and looked at him, this man she had been married to for 7 years, who had 8 names for their chickens and a deep abiding attachment to a roan horse named Birdie, who was indeed frequently difficult, and who looked at her every morning across the breakfast table with an attention that had never diminished, as though she was still a thing worth observing with full care. "I'm thinking that I'm happy," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, that steady, complete look. "So am I," he said. And then, because he was a man of specific and accurate language, "Thoroughly," she laughed. James looked up from his grasshopper pursuit at the sound of his mother laughing, registered the situation as satisfactory, and returned to his chase. Frances looked up from her pebble, deemed the porch situation uninteresting, and returned to her examination. The evening settled around them, warm and still and full. The sun dropped toward the horizon, and the sky went through its colors gold to orange, to a deep rose that was almost the color of Sadie's wedding dress. And the cattle moved in the distant pasture, and the wind ran through the grass as it always had and always would, that long, level, unhurried wind that was the signature of this particular corner of the country, the sound of something so enormous and so continuous that a person living under it eventually came to feel simply held. She had arrived as a widow with nothing. She had been given a hand by a man who asked nothing in return. And from that simple beginning, directions given, the honest words spoken, a name exchanged in the red dust of a Tuesday afternoon, everything else had followed. The business, the home, the marriage, the children, the community, the life that had grown up out of the hard earth of the Panhandle and bloomed there stubbornly and beautifully, the way the wildflowers did every May, with a color and extravagance that the landscape did not at first appear to promise. Lionel reached over and took her hand, resting it in his on the arm of the porch chair, the way he had on the back step in February of the first year, warm and certain. She laced her fingers through his. James finally caught his grasshopper and held it up with the triumphant incredulity of a boy who has achieved the summit of what he set out to do, and is only now confronting the question of what comes next. Frances had moved on from the pebble to what appeared to be an investigation of an anthill, her small face solemn with scientific interest. The stars began coming out one by one overhead, the first of them faint and tentative, and then more of them as the light faded, until the sky was full of them, that Texas sky, that preposterous, enormous, generous sky that went on so far in every direction it made you feel both very small and somehow, impossibly, exactly the right size. Alma Cooper Atkins sat on her porch and held her husband's hand and looked up at the stars, and she was, in all the ways that matter, exactly where she was supposed to be. The chickens, all 6 of them, named and properly attended to, settled into their coop for the night. And Harlan's Crossing, that honest little town in the Texas Panhandle, went about its quiet evening business around them, unhurried and certain, the way a place does when it has found its people and knows they have found it too.